I'm back. No more Facebook. I'm on YouTube now. I know you missed me. Lefty!
What?
Please be quiet. What are you doing? You don't need to play with your toys right now. I know, action figures, all the rage right now.
Man, I spent 45 minutes setting this stuff up.
I need to film this video. Please go and edit a podcast or something.
I gotta post these pictures up to Instagram.
No, I told you. Just give me a few minutes. Go edit a podcast. Put your He-Man down. And let's leave it at that.
Hey.
What?
Let me finish. Let me put my light up.
No. Just go and edit a podcast. Do something productive in peace and quiet.
Okay, I'm coming.
Jeez. Where was I?
Somebody should tune you up.
This video is all about tuning a Nitro engine. Oh my God. Matt.
Hello.
I'm sitting here like an idiot. Roll the intro.
Intro.
Pay attention.
Yep. Okay.
Amateur hour. This video is all about Nitro engines, specifically the carburetor or carburetor. Which is it anyway?
Kaar-byuuh-reh-tr. Kaar-byuuh-reh-tr.
Carb. This video is all about the carb. We're going to go over how this thing works, what the needles do, and how to tune it, basically. And I have some good news. I am going to prove to you that tuning these engines is not actually as hard as people make it out to be, because there's a secret. There's a well-kept, unknown secret to tuning these things, which will make even you a master tuner with some practice. Not you, Lefty.
Just shut up. I can tune an engine.
This new project, this video, and this whole YouTube channel project, it's all thanks to Patreon. So all the people that support JQ Racing, well, the Quagrain actually on Patreon, and especially the 100, huge shout out and thank you to you guys, because you made all of this possible. And if you find this video helpful, then please like and subscribe, and maybe post a comment. You can ask for future topics or something like that in the comments. And if these videos prove to be popular, then I'll keep on doing them. So before we talk about the tuning of the carb, I think it's helpful to look at the engine and just go over the basics so you understand how the engine works. Because if I just explain how to tune the engine and you don't understand what's happening, then you're just going to memorize it. And when you memorize how to tune a carb, it doesn't really necessarily make sense. And maybe you'll forget some things and you'll be in a situation where you can't figure out what to do because you don't remember what I said, which direction were you supposed to tune. And it's not the best way to do it. The best way to learn to tune an engine is to understand what's happening. And when you understand the basic principles of what's happening, then you can be in a situation where you need to tune the engine. You can take a step back, you can think about what's happening, and then you can figure it out. That's the best way.
And that's the way, I like it.
So when the engine's running, what's happening is that air enters the carb through the air filter, fuel enters from the fuel tank through the fuel tubing, enters the carb, and in the carb body, the air and the fuel mix. Then as the crankshaft turns, it's actually hollow and there's an opening in it. So it opens up and the air and fuel mixture enters the crankshaft. And as it's hollow, it then travels through the crankshaft and exits through the back of the crankshaft. And from there, it then gets sucked up into the sleeve through the ports in the sleeve above the piston. So then if we imagine this is the piston, we now have this mixture of air and fuel above the piston, and the piston is moving up. And up above, we have the head button and the combustion chamber, essentially, with the glow plug up at the top. So the piston is moving up and it's compressing this mixture of air and fuel. And then right at the top here, what happens is the compressed mixture of air and fuel, the oxygen in the air and the fuel, they react thanks to the spark from the glow plug. So what happens is it catches fire, but it's under pressure, so it's actually an explosion. And that explosion pushes the piston back down. Now I said spark, but in real cars, they actually have spark plugs and they're actually timed to give a spark at a certain time, but we don't have that. So in our engines, we have a glow plug. And what happens is that the wire, the filament of the glow plug, it just keeps glowing. That's what you do when you put the glow igniter on. You're feeding an electrical current to the glow plug and making it glow. And then once the engine is running, it stays glowing. So we essentially have a constant spark. But anyway, that's like a side note. So just remember, piston is moving up. You have the mixture of air and fuel, and you have this glowing plug up there. And as it compresses somewhere here at the top, explosion, piston moves down. That explosion is actually the power of the engine. Essentially, it's the power of the engine because that's what pushes the piston down, and then the exhaust exits through the exhaust port, through the manifold and the pipe. And the crankshaft, which I had the opening had actually closed at this point. Now it reopens and new air and fuel enters the crankshaft. And then the cycle repeats. So that's how the engine keeps running.
Oh, so that's how it works.
So the key to engine performance is actually that explosion. We want a really powerful explosion. We want the engine to have a lot of power. And the key to that is really the amount of oxygen and the amount of fuel. That determines what kind of explosion we get and how the engine runs. In chemistry, there's actually this thing called stoichiometry. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Is it stoichiometry?
Stoichiometry.
Let's just say it's stoichiometry. And there's something called the stoichiometric ratio. And that, actually, let's back up a bit. Stoichiometry, what the hell is that? So stoichiometry is a study where you study the ratios of different chemicals that react and then the result of that. So in this case, we would be studying the amount of oxygen and the amount of fuel, and then them reacting and then what's left over. So there's something called a stoichiometric ratio. And for us, that would mean that in the combustion event, all the oxygen is burned up and all the fuel is burned up. And that's like the perfect scenario. The combustion event happens and it's an efficient, clean burn. The fuel is burned up, the oxygen is burned up. We're making maximum power, in theory. Now, in gasoline engines, in real cars, they actually measure this. They want to know what the stoichiometric ratio is, and it's something like 14.7 to 1. That's what I found when I used the Google. And what that means is you need 14.7 units of air to 1 unit of fuel. So you need a lot more air than fuel to achieve this perfect burn, perfect combustion event. Now in our engines, we actually don't need that much air compared to the fuel, because think about it. So we're very limited with the size, and we can't get that much oxygen into these things. We can't get that much air in here. So we use different fuel. That's why we use fuel with nitromethane in it, so methanol and nitromethane. And the thing is that they burn better than gasoline. And the reason that is because nitromethane, it contains oxygen in itself. So we can get more power by using this fuel, because we don't just rely on the oxygen in the atmosphere, we also have oxygen in the fuel that we run. So this gives us more power. So we want as much air as possible into the engine, as much oxygen as we can get into that combustion chamber. And then we want to adjust the amount of fuel so that the ratio is just right. That's essentially what the carb is doing. We are adjusting the amount of fuel that enters the engine to match the amount of oxygen that we have. So remember I said that there's this thing called the stoichiometric ratio. And that means that in the combustion event, all the oxygen and all the fuel burns up. So let's just imagine we're at that point now. That's how our engine is running. If we then allow more fuel to enter, what would happen is that all the oxygen would burn up, but there would be some fuel left over. And that's what we call rich. So the engine would be running rich. There's fuel left over, and that's actually a good thing, because in the fuel we have oil, and the oil is what lubricates the engine. So if we run the engine rich, that means that in the combustion event, the oxygen burns and there's fuel left over, which means that there's oil left over that lubricates the parts. So it's a good way to run an engine because it runs cooler, it protects all the moving parts. It's a safe way to run an engine. Then if you reverse that, if you say we're running at this perfect stoichiometric ratio, where all that oxygen, all the fuel is burning up, if we reduce the amount of fuel that enters the engine, then we are in a situation where all the fuel gets burned up in the combustion event, but there's some oxygen left over. Now this isn't a very good way to run an engine, because what happens is there's not that much lubrication left, because you're burning up all the fuel. There's so much oxygen compared to the amount of fuel that it's burning up all the fuel that and the oils that would be there to lubricate the parts. So typically the engine runs hotter, and it's not good for the engine. Obviously, with an engine, the whole point is that you can run it at idle, then you can open the throttle more and get more power, and then full throttle, you have maximum power. So there's this sliding scale of the throttle is closed, it's idling, and then throttle is fully open, maximum power. Now, as the throttle opens, more air is entering the carb and then the engine. We need to, through using the needles here, that's actually why a carb has more than one needle. We have high-speed needle, low-speed needle. We need to adjust these so that throughout the full range of the carb's positions, the ratio between the air and the fuel is good. That's really what the needles themselves and their positions do. That they regulate the amount of fuel at different throttle positions so that it matches the amount of air in the air that can enter the engine through the carb. And that's what we are doing when we are tuning the engine. And now it might make sense to you why you can't just tune the engine once and then leave it. Because that's what we would all like. We'd like to tune an engine one time and then just forget about it. Now it's good, performs well, just leave it.
It's good. It's good.
Imagine a scenario where your engine's running perfectly. Just dialed. Master tuner level. So let's say you go to the track and it's much hotter than before. So in high temperature, there's going to be less oxygen in the air. So your engine will run a bit rich. So you might have to lean out your engine a bit. Because remember, you still have the same amount of fuel going in the engine, but now there's less oxygen. So all the oxygen burns, fuel left over. It's rich. Then at low temperature, there's a lot more oxygen in the air. So at low temperature, your engine might run a bit lean, and then you might have to richen your engine a bit. Same goes for altitude. So high altitude, less oxygen. Your engine could run a bit rich. Might have to lean out the engine. Low altitude, sea level for example, more oxygen. So your engine might run lean, and then you might have to richen your engine a bit. And then last of all, humidity. So at high humidity, now it flips. High humidity, more oxygen in the air. So your engine might run lean. You might have to richen your engine a bit. And then low humidity, less oxygen, and your engine might run rich. So you might have to lean out the engine a bit. So these things affect the tune, and that's why we need to constantly adjust our engines. Okay, I think we can go to take a look at the carb now. Did you get that, Keenan?
I don't really care, so I don't understand.
What?
Right over my head.
How do you not understand? I just spent 10 minutes explaining something that a child could understand.
I don't go in science mode like you, man.
The performance of an engine depends on the air-fuel mixture.
As long as it runs and no cuts out and has power, I'm good.
And you adjust that mixture, you regulate that mixture by tuning the carb. It's responsible for maintaining that mixture throughout all the positions of the throttle. That's the idea.
I just heard something about stoichiometers.
There's something, no, not stoichiometers. There's something called the stoichiometric ratio. It means that it's a perfect combustion. All the oxygen, all the fuel burns.
Nobody cares about stoichiometers or whatever that is.
If the oxygen burns and there's fuel left over, the mixture is rich. If the opposite happens, all the fuel burns and there's oxygen left over, it's lean. When an engine runs rich, it's good because there's fuel and oil left over in the engine to lubricate it. That's how you should run your engine.
Just make it run.
What don't you understand?
I don't understand how your brain functions, man.
It's not rocket science.
You get all nerdy, man.
Oh my God, this guy. Did you understand? I hope you understood. If not, then just go back and listen to it again. This is a classic carb. This is the 21J made by OS in Japan. This is the ultimate racing version. So it says M line on it. But it's the same OS 21J. This right here, this is the high-speed needle, or top end or main needle. Over here we have the low-speed needle, or low end or bottom end needle. And this is a carb with three, well, people say needles, but this isn't actually a needle. OS calls this a mixture control valve. And then finally we have this. This is just the idle stop screw. And this is where the air filter goes. So the air filter attaches on here. Air goes in there. Comes out here. This is where the carb attaches to the engine. You can see right through the carb there. You see now the throttle is closed. There we open it. And here's a rubber boot to protect the slide. That's where the fuel goes in. Yeah. That's what a carb looks like. We're done with the video, right?
We won.
All right, hey. All right, good job, guys.
No, we're not done. So this high-speed needle, this is what regulates fuel flow at full throttle. So when the throttle is wide open, this needle regulates the amount of fuel entering the carb. So this right here, this is the body for the high-speed needle. So as you can see, it's hollow. You can see right through it. And there's a hole there. So when the fuel enters, it will go into this hole and then flow into the body of the carb. So let's just attach the high-speed needle. The needle goes in right here. So the fuel tubing attaches here. The fuel flows in here through the hole that I just showed you into the center hollow part of the main needle holder or body. And then it flows down into the carb. So what you are actually doing when you are adjusting this high-speed needle. As you can see, the needle is tapered, and as you tighten the needle, you are reducing the space the fuel has to flow into the body of the carb. So essentially, the high-speed needle limits the total amount of fuel that can enter the carb. Once that fuel has entered the carb, then the mixture control valve becomes relevant. Now, some engines don't have this third, which people call the third needle, but it's like you can see, it's not actually a needle. It's this valve. It's hollow. You can see that there's a hole at the end, and it's hollow inside, and then there's a hole here for fuel to flow into. But let's attach this and then I'll explain how it works. So now we're at the situation where fuel has flown in, it's flown past the high-speed needle, and it's entered the body of the carb. And here you can see that in this area that's limited by this O-ring, inner O-ring here and outer O-ring here, this becomes a chamber for the fuel. It's almost like a float ball. And what this does is, as the throttle opens, the bigger this chamber is, the more fuel can quickly flow into the engine. When you adjust this mixture control valve, what actually happens is, when I tighten this screw, the size of this chamber here, the amount of volume, the amount of fuel that can be stored here, ready to go into the engine as the throttle opens, this actually reduces. So there will be less fuel available, which means that the mid-range of the engine will be leaner. And when I open this mixture control valve, the opposite happens. So it grows. So there'll be more fuel available here. So this then causes the mid-range to be richer. There's one more thing that happens when you adjust the mixture control valve, but I'm not convinced that it plays a big role in the performance of the mid-range. It has to do with how the valve moves into the opening of the carb. So you can see that it's moving in and out there, and that's what we call the spray bar. And we'll touch on that later when we talk about the low-speed needle. But as I said, I believe that for mid-range performance, what's more relevant is the size of that chamber there for the fuel. Okay, so let's move on. We're now at the stage where the fuel has entered the carburetor, it's flown past the high-speed needle, it's flown through the mixture control valve, and now the fuel is exiting this hole here. So it's exiting the spray bar. And now we need to talk about the low-speed needle. But before that, we have this part. This is the carb barrel, or the slider. This is the part that slides in and out as the throttle opens. So it goes in the end of the carb here. Let's see. Like so. So this is actually what opens the throttle. So it's closed now, and then you open it. Boom. Full throttle. And this is what I've been using as a pointer. This is the low-speed needle. As you can see here, there's an O-ring at the end, then a portion of threads, and it's just lengthened so that it reaches into the carb, and then the end is tapered. So this needle slides in the barrel, and you can see that the end slides into the spray bar there, into the mixture control valve. And I'll just attach this to its proper setting so you can see what happens. So the airflow is going through here. So when the throttle is closed, when the throttle is at idle, very little air, you can see through the carb there, a small amount of air can get in. So not we don't need a lot of fuel either at this point. But as the throttle opens, more and more air can flow through the carb into the engine. So we also need to allow for more fuel to flow into the engine. Because remember, the key point is the mixture of air and fuel. So the more air you have, the more fuel you also need. So as you can see, this tapered low-speed needle is pulling out of the spray bar here. And as it's pulling out, it's allowing for more fuel to enter the engine. The low-speed needle, what you are really adjusting for with it is the engine performance at idle, and you're adjusting it for initial opening of the throttle, initial acceleration. As you close the needle, it goes deeper into the spray bar and reduces the amount of fuel that can flow through here. So closing the needle will reduce the amount of fuel flow leaning out the engine. So at idle like this, less fuel can enter the engine. And when you open the low-speed needle, the opposite is true. So you see the tapered part is moving out of the spray bar, allowing for more fuel to flow in. So the engine will be richer. And finally, we have the idle stop screw. So this isn't a needle that adjusts fuel flow. This is just a mechanical stop screw to adjust the position of the barrel. So we've been looking at this side of the carb all along. Now we flip it over, and over here you can see that there's a groove in the barrel. And this screw goes in here, and once I tighten it up, you can see that it's going to go into that groove, limiting the movement of the barrel. You can see that it's actually stopping the barrel from moving further in. So just to demonstrate that, if I tighten the idle stop screw, it actually starts moving the barrel outwards. And if I open up the screw, you see now I can push the barrel further in. This screw also limits how far the barrel can move out. So now it's at full throttle. Without this screw, this part, this slide, the barrel, it would come out all the way. So it's stopping the barrel at full throttle and also adjusting the point at which it stops when you push it in. This is essentially now the idle position. I'll show it on another carb and then explain the idle gap to you, because that, my friend, is key to everything. Okay, so here's another carb I'm going to use to show you what the idle gap is. Now, if you've fallen asleep, if you're not paying attention, focus. Now is the time to wake up, because now we're getting into the business. This is the key to everything. So you see how there's that crescent moon shape in there? That's the opening of the carb right now. Now the carb is at idle. So when I tighten the idle stop screw, it moves the barrel out, and you see that gap is growing. So now the gap is quite big. Loosen the screw, it closes this gap. Now this gap is referred to as the idle gap. And this is the secret. The idle gap is the secret. So what's going on here? Let's just take a minute to think about it. As we close this screw and the gap grows, more air is allowed to enter the engine. As we open it and close the gap, less air is allowed to enter the engine. Now, I just want you to remember this basic concept, because when we watch the tuning videos, we'll be talking about this. And right now, before explaining the reason why, I just want to explain that the secret to tuning success is to know what your idle gap is. And I'm going to show you how to measure it now. So to measure the idle gap, we can use this. Ironside it's called. The brand. It's this thing that you can measure gaps with. It's called a precision feeler gauge, or in Deutsch,
Präzisionsführerlehre.
Français,
Jauge d'épaisseur.
Dutch, Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian,
Precisionsförlemåler.
Spanish,
Dandare espessores.
Portuguese.
Apalpa folgas.
There we go. It looks like I'm gonna need to use a Dremel on this thing. These are too big. Okay, done. There we go. Now they work with a 8-scale Nitro buggy carb. Kind of fits with the JQ brand also, don't you think? Yep, I see the resemblance. We only need a few of them. Only need from 0.5 to 0.7. On the OS, based on experience, I know that I run an idle gap from 0.45 millimeters to 0.55. So a good setting to start with would be 0.5. Now personally, I always start with 0.45, but let's play it safe now. 0.5, that's what we want the idle gap to be. So with the pointy tip that we just created here, we want to slide that into the carb body. Not too deep, because you see that the spray bar sort of shape, you can see it down there, so you don't want to go that deep. You just here at the edge, then you close the carb all the way, and you want it to just barely touch the feeler gauge out. It's too tight right now, so I need to open up. So I close the idle gap screw. Now I can feel it just barely touching. So I know it's at 0.5. So once I've measured the idle gap, and I've now set the idle gap to 0.5, what I like to do then is I like to make a small mark here on the carb itself. So now on this one, I've marked where the screw is when the idle gap is at 0.5 millimeters. And what I'll do is I'll actually mark 0.55 here, and when you open the screw somewhere here would be 0.45. So let me do that right now. There we go. Now we have 3 markings on the carb. We have 0.5, 0.45, 0.55. So now we know where our idle gap is. Without having to measure it, we can easily see now the idle gap screw is in the open position. So that means that the idle gap is the smallest, 0.45. So if we close it to there, it's 0.5, close it to there, it's 0.55. I've been going on about this idle gap now for a minute, and I just want to one more time confirm how important this is, because when the throttle closes to idle, if you have an idle gap that is too big, you need to compensate by opening the low speed needle. So the big idle gap means that a lot of air is going into the engine, so you need more fuel. So you have to open the low speed needle, move it out, richen it. When you have this kind of setting on an engine, it creates problems that we're going to talk about in a minute when we watch some videos. And a good engine tuner, someone that's a master of engine tuning, they don't necessarily need to measure this gap. What they do is they will, by iteration, by readjusting and readjusting, they will actually achieve a small idle gap. But why do that? Why not just measure it from the beginning? So what an experienced engine tuner will do, I'll show you later on, but I'll explain it here too. So just we'll repeat it a couple of times and this will really stick with you. So let's say you start and your idle gap is big like this. So a lot of air and a lot of fuel. Now, the engine sounds fine. It may idle good and rev up fine. But what you notice is there's a two-stage idle. There's a double idle. First, the engine starts to idle, and then a few seconds later, the idle drops. So this, an experienced engine tuner will know, is because initially the mixture is good, but then because so much fuel is flowing into the engine, the engine can't burn up all the fuel anymore, and it starts running rich. And when it starts running rich, the idle drops. So what does the experienced engine tuner do? He closes the low speed needle. So he keeps closing the low speed needle until the idle doesn't drop that quickly anymore. But now the idle starts being too high. Okay, so then he closes the gap a bit. So now the idle gap is smaller, less air is going in, the idle is more constant. But there's still a double idle. He can still tell that that's still not good. So then he closes the low speed needle some more. And again, the revs are high. So then he closes the idle gap a bit more. And eventually he'll reach a stage where the idle gap is at the correct setting. On an OS, it will be 0.45 to 0.5. And when the engine goes to idle, it just stays at idle. It doesn't drop anymore. There's no more double idle. So that's how an experienced engine tuner can essentially achieve the correct idle gap without measuring it. But like I said, there's a secret to this engine tuning. What I just showed you, measuring this gap, that's key to everything. So I'm not sure about all engines what the idle gap should be, but I know for a fact that for OS 0.45, 0.5, 0.55, that's a really good range. Now I have heard that some other engine brands require a slightly larger idle gap, but I would say that between 0.5 and 0.7, that should cover all engine brands. So try to find out what the best idle gap is for your engine, and just measure the idle gap and go as small as possible. And then don't adjust the idle stop screw to set the idle. Only adjust the low speed needle to set the idle. So you measure the idle gap, you set the idle stop screw to that idle gap, and then you adjust the idle RPM with the low speed needle. That's the way to do it. Okay, enough nerding out now. Let's go tune this at the track. Okay, I know this video has been going on forever, and we still haven't even started the engine. But there's just one more thing I need to go over, because this is such a common mistake. Leave a small gap here in the linkage. You leave this gap so you know that the linkage returns the carb to idle. What happens sometimes is that you return the throttle to idle, but the carb is slightly open. Then when you go to brake, it closes all the way and your engine dies. This is a very common mistake. So just leave a small gap here. It also helps for any kind of flex or anything that can happen on the track where the servo moves a bit. You don't want that to open the throttle. So just a tiny gap there. Make sure it returns to idle, and you can check it like this. Then set your endpoint. Set your endpoint so that as you open the throttle, you want it to open as much as whatever Venturi you're using. So I'm using the 7mm Venturi. So my throttle, you can see it here, it opens to 7mm. So it can still open further. I just don't use that. One last thing. I promise this is the last thing. Just to be safe, you need a failsafe, because if your electronics die, for example, something goes wrong, you don't want a runaway. So to solve that, you get these. Just some hairbands. Super cheap. Just get a bunch of them together. And then what you do is you just wrap them. Well, the air filter isn't there now, but you would wrap them around the air filter. And then I replace that grub screw with a normal screw here. So I wrap the rubber bands around that screw. And then if I lose power at full throttle, for example, it's going to return it to neutral. So cheap, very effective fail-safe. So just make sure that you have enough rubber bands that it can return the throttle to neutral. It needs to be able to pull the servo from any position, and that's all you need. Okay, I'm back from the track. I went there, tuned my engine every which way. People thought I was nuts, and well, they are right, so I can't blame them. I got a ton of videos. We're going to watch them now together, and I'm going to comment on them. But remember, this video is only about tuning the carb, how the carb works, how to tune it, how to get the most out of your engine. It's not about a lot of other things that are relevant, like how to prepare a new engine, install a flywheel, clutch, all that stuff, assemble it into the car, how to break in the engine, how to maintain your engine, change bearings. All those kind of videos already exist. So I don't want to redo those now. Instead, I linked them in the description. So check the description of this video. There's great videos done by, for example, Mick Craddock. He has a few good ones linked there. And there's this channel also, RW Mods. Some guy from America, he reviews engines, tears them apart, talks about all the different moving parts and what they do. So if you're interested in these engines and you want to learn more, check those videos. Another thing to note is that before you start tuning your engine, something I did also was I warmed up the engine and I actually did a few laps. So the best way to really saturate the engine with heat and get to the point where you can tune it is by running a few laps. Then you know that you're getting the correct tune when you tune your engine. So a cold engine, it will then, the tune will change a bit as the engine heats up. So always warm your engine up. I would say that about 100 degrees Celsius is okay. So 100 degrees Celsius, or for you illogical Americans, 212 Fahrenheit. So if you're around that temperature range, then it's good to tune your engine. So let's go watch these videos. And I hope that this will really help you understand. Actually, you know what? This will really help you understand how to tune your engine. Let's be positive. So let's go watch some videos together. Oh, I need these. Can't hear anything. Let's just begin with the basics. So how a good idle runs. So what does that sound like? Just nice and steady. And now low idle. So this is just a tad too low. And there you go, it died. So let's go back and just listen to the transition there. So first I had it to the good idle, then I lowered it a bit to where it's a bit unsafe. You can almost hear the individual sort of tick, tick, tick. Just listen to the difference. And if your idle is too low, then it can just die when you brake going into a corner, for example, or something like that. So you want the idle to be just right. And now the idle is unnecessarily high. So the high idle, the engine's going to run okay, it's not going to stop. But the thing is that the idle actually affects the performance of the engine. So if the idle is too low, there's a bit of a delay. You don't feel as connected to the engine. If the idle is too high, you lose power. So it makes sense to try and set the idle correctly. Next, we're going to look at the high-speed needle. So this is a good setting for the high-speed needle. So you can hear the maximum RPM, and then once I let go of the throttle, it just drops back to idle. So a good high-speed needle setting. And then listen to the difference, because this is going to transition into a rich high-speed needle, and you can hear that the revs don't go as high. So could you tell the difference there? Let's go back and just repeat that. So a clear difference in the maximum revs. The good high-speed needle and then the slightly rich high-speed needle. And the rich high-speed needle, it still sounds okay. I mean, it returns to idle. There's nothing crazy going on. You're just not getting the most out of your engine. So it's okay, it just sounds a bit lazy and doesn't rev as high. And now I'm going to show you what happens with a lean high-speed needle. You barely hear it, but the idle is fine. Get on the gas, and then the idle stays high. And it stays high because the high-speed needle is too lean. So that engine is starving for fuel. And when you let go of the throttle, the idle stays high. And then it takes a while to drop. So the idle was fine. Rev it. The top end is lean. Now the idle doesn't settle, it stays high. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to introduce a bit more fuel to the engine. So the idle is staying high, but the way to know that it's actually the high-speed needle that is lean and not the low-speed needle is I just blip the throttle a bit and the idle goes down. So if the case was that the low-speed needle was lean, you're going to see it a bit later in the video, but then the idle would rise, but it doesn't. It just, you rev the engine, the idle doesn't drop down, you blip the throttle a bit, the idle goes down. So we know that it's the high-speed needle that's too lean here. So just listen to this. So did you hear that? I just blipped it a bit and the idle went down. Because it was starving for fuel and the low-speed needle was set just right. So it wasn't rich, it wasn't lean, it was just right. So it wasn't giving the engine extra fuel. So the lean high-speed needle was very obvious in this example. And there's another way to tell this on track. So I'm going to show you some footage from after the front straight on the track. So here you can see I'm driving down the front straight and then I hit the brakes, coast for a bit and then get on the gas a bit. Get on the gas again. And you can hear that the idle never settles. The idle just stays high. And that's because, again, the engine is starved for fuel at full throttle. So that high-speed needle is too lean. It doesn't drop back down to idle. So listen to that. And then immediately after that, we go into a video of a well-tuned high-speed needle where you can see that I go down the straight, do the exact same thing, but the revs drop to idle. So, of course, when the engine is tuned well and the revs drop to idle, the car will be a lot easier to drive because it's not going to be running on. So, yeah, just let's watch this. So there you saw the difference. So the first example was the high-speed needle was lean, revs didn't drop. Second, high-speed needle was just right. I had the revs on the straight, I had the speed on the straight, but as soon as I let go of the throttle, the revs dropped to idle. Next, we have a good low-speed needle setting. Just listen to how the revs pick up. So this low-speed needle is good, the idle stays steady, it doesn't change. I get on the throttle, the revs pick up. Now we're going to go to a rich low-speed needle. So now listen to the difference. So did you notice there? So there were two different things that happened. One was after I let off the throttle the second time, it went to idle nicely, but then it almost immediately dropped. And that's because the low-speed needle is rich. So with the rich low-speed needle, the idle drops nicely, but then it drops again. And we don't want that. The second thing that happened was that I revved it the first time, the RPM went this high. Revved it the second time, almost immediately, it went higher. And the reason for that is that the engine is flooded with fuel. So the more you rev it, the more it clears out. And that's why you see that difference, that the first time you rev it, the revs don't go as high. Then you rev it again, the engine has cleared out more, it revs higher. And this is actually a very common mistake in tuning people make. So they run the engine so that the low-speed needle is rich, and then they can't get the revs up, so they lean the high-speed needle too much. But we're gonna watch some tuning of an engine all the way from like base super rich settings to race tune, and you're gonna see the problem there. But anyway, let's move on. So listen to this now. Now we can go back a bit so it's clearer. So rich low-speed needle. So there you go, the idle went down. So rich low-speed needle, idle goes down, and you have to work at clearing the engine, cleaning the engine. And when you rev it, the more you rev it, the higher the revs eventually go. And now a lean low-speed needle. Okay, so now the opposite happens. So the revs pick up nicely. You can hear the top end is good. Drops down to idle okay. But then almost immediately you can hear that the idle revs are going up. So the RPM on idle goes up, because now the engine isn't getting enough fuel on idle. So let's listen to that again. So you hear that. The engine sounds okay, goes back to idle nicely, but then the idle starts rising. So low speed needle, too lean. And what's next? Next we go to a very lean low speed needle. So just to complicate things a bit, listen to this. So do you hear this? So I'm revving the engine, and then it seems like the idle doesn't settle, and then it goes way down. So what's happening here is the low speed needle is so lean that after I rev the engine, I let go of the throttle, the idle doesn't even settle. It just, there's not enough fuel to even let the engine idle, and then the engine is starving for fuel, so it's dying. It's almost dying. And this is typical for old engines. When engines get old, worn out, no compression, air leaks, it becomes really difficult to set the idle. You just can't get it to idle. It keeps dying. And there's no way of tuning around it with a really old engine. But this engine is fine. There should be no problem with this. So here I can just tell that the low speed needle is way too lean. So like you hear, the idle doesn't really settle, and then it wants to die. What's next? Now, okay, mid-range. So we talked about the mid-range already. Now I'll show you what it does, how you can hear it. Okay, so this is a mid-range that's set well. So when you pull the throttle slowly, it's very linear and smooth, and there's constant trail of smoke coming out the pipe. It's just, you can hear it's smooth, consistent, and the RPM is going up. And then when I pull the throttle quickly, the revs go up nice and quick also. So there you go, well set mid-range. So now you're going to tell the difference of the mid-range, because now everything else was the same. What I did was I richened the mid-range and then adjusted the low speed needle to match. So this is just a different mid-range setting. The low speed needle isn't too rich here. The low speed needle is just fine. So now, if you compare to the previous one, I'm doing the same thing. I'm pulling the throttle, opening the throttle slowly, and you can tell that after the initial, after the revs go up initially, you can hear that the engine is richer. Just let's go back and listen again. Right there. And you can also see a lot more smoke coming out. And then when I pull the throttle faster, the revs don't go up as fast. Also not as high. So again, it's like a bit similar to a rich low speed needle. It's loading up the engine as I pull the throttle. Okay, so this is now a lean mid range setting. So like you saw there, the engine sounded fine first, but when I pull the trigger slowly, so I'm opening the throttle slowly, after the initial rise in revs, you can tell that the engine is lean, and then at some point it picks up again and there's smoke. You can even tell that there's no smoke for a while and then there's smoke. Let's go back and just watch that again. A bit further back. Here we go. So you heard that. When I went slow, there was that one section of throttle where it was lean, not enough fuel was getting in. And then also when I was at idle and then just revved it quickly, the revs go up super quick. Okay, now we're going to listen to a two-stage idle. This is very common, super common, and sometimes it's actually quite tricky to get rid of, but I'm going to show you a trick for that. So let's listen. So you hear the idle is fine. It can be fine for even 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds even, but then it drops. So let's see if I did that again. Okay, so the engine sounded fine, and I don't know, 5-6 seconds there, idling fine, and then the revs dropped. So there's a two-stage idle. Now, the engine would probably run fine like this. But the thing is that it's a bit more risky, and it's just a bit more inconsistent, because with the double idle, maybe you set the idle so most of the time the idle is a bit too high, so you're not getting the best performance of the engine. And then at the times that then it does drop during a race or crash or pit stop or whatever, it's not too low to stop the engine. Or then maybe you've set the engine so that it sounds fine, everything's great, but then those critical moments where the two-stage idle causes the idle to drop, the car flames out. So this is one very common reason for mystery flameouts and engines seeming to run fine, but then for some reason they flame out. It's the double idle. We need to get rid of this. So let's listen to a good idle. Okay, so the idle is good. And I just want to prove to you that it is possible to have an engine just idle, just sit there and idle. So we're just gonna let it idle. You know, not 10 seconds, 30 seconds. Let's just see, 30 seconds of idle, and then just get on the gas and see what happens. There you go. So there is a way to tune the engine where there is no double idle. It can just sit there and idle. Well, maybe not forever, but a very long time. Longer than you would ever need it to idle in a race. And then you just get on the gas, revs go up, everything's fine. So let's get into that actually. How do you do that? So now I'm going to show you how to tune an engine from a rich setting. Now, one question that people ask a lot is, do you have the sort of factory settings of an engine? Or they ask for some kind of magic setting like measuring needles or how many turns out from all the way closed. And I never really believed in that, because there's no way to tell someone where to put their needles so that the engine will run right. Except this one, the mid-range. On an OS 21J, you measure this, you make it 0.1 millimeters in from flush. And I don't seriously need to mention the idle stop screw, do I? You know this already. 0.45 to 0.55. Start off with a 0.5 millimeter idle gap. It's not possible, you know, that you run different fuels at different locations, altitudes, temperature, humidity, weather, like it doesn't work that way. What you want to do is you just want to start from the rich side. So make sure your high-speed needle and low-speed needle are rich and the idle gap is big enough, you know. So I think manufacturers actually offer that information, like break-in settings. So just do that and then start tuning. So this is a video of me tuning an engine like that. So I know the needles are rich and I start tuning. But key thing, I don't know where the idle gap is. This is how most people tune. The idle gap's big. I don't know how big. Another important point is the amount that you adjust the needles. How much do you actually turn them? Well, it's good to imagine a clock face around the needle. And then when you adjust, you only adjust about 1 hour or 5 minutes either way. And then when you are really close to the perfect adjustment, you're literally just adjusting the width of the slit in the screw. So maybe just 1 minute, just to get the perfect setting. So adjusting high-speed needle first, lowering idle a bit. It's not really revving up. Idle is dropping, so I lean out the low-speed needle. Idle is still dropping. So I lean out the low speed needle more. I lower the idle. So remember, as you lean out the low speed needle, the RPM at idle will stay higher. So you have to reduce the idle gap. So there I reduce the idle gap some more. Not quite revving up, so I leaned that high-speed needle just there. So you can hear the RPM is getting higher, it's getting better. Smaller idle gap, lower idle. So there I waited a bit, just let it idle. It does idle steadily, but then I get on the gas and it still seems that the engine is loading up, that it's rich. So I lean the low speed needle some more. Now can you hear the idle is a bit high, so I think I'm gonna lower the idle, so reduce the idle gap. No, still leaning out the low speed. Okay, there you go. Okay, so there you go. So now the engine seems fine, but it was already good a while ago. I just kept leaning out the low speed, lowering the idle, leaning out the low speed, lowering the idle, because I know that had I left it like it was a bit earlier, let's go back a bit, it would have run fine, but it would have had that double idle. Like this could already be like, oh, it's okay. But I'm still leaning out the low speed needle. And I'm still reducing the idle gap. And that's because I want to achieve the smallest idle gap that works. That's what I'm doing here. It's iteration, like I mentioned earlier. Okay, so now the same thing, except now I'm tuning an engine where I know the idle gap. So I set the idle gap here to 0.5 millimeters. And since I did that, I don't need to touch the idle stop screw. I don't need to change the idle gap. I know where it is. I'm leaving it. I'm happy with it. So to set the idle, I'm just going to adjust the low speed needle. And then the high speed needle, I'm just going to adjust that for maximum revs. So let's watch that. So as you can hear, the idle is super low. It's almost not running. So I'm going to lean the low speed needle now to raise the idle. I'm going to lean the top end. So I just kept leaning the top end to where it's sort of ballpark. It's not perfect yet, but it's close enough. And the idle is still very low. It sounds like the engine is going to stop, so I'm going to lean the low speed needle. Still leaning it more. Leaning the high-speed needle a bit. Idle sounds good. Revs pick up nicely. High-speed needle is good. Do you see how much easier that was? Because I know where the idle gap is. I know it's right. I just need to set the idle correctly with the low-speed needle and the maximum revs with the high-speed needle. Boom. The engine's going to run. There's not going to be any two-stage idle. And it's just way easier. So I definitely recommend this way of tuning your engines. Okay, I think that was it. Yep, that's it. Okay, so we made it through. You know what? I'm really tired. I know this video definitely needs a conclusion, so I'm gonna film that tomorrow. I'm gonna go to bed because it's late.
I'm pretty tired. Think I'll go home now.
There we go. I hope you enjoyed that. Hopefully you found what we just did, what we went over, to be helpful. There's just one more thing I'd like to cover, and something I didn't bring up really yet, and that's the Venturi. So the Venturi in the carb, what it does, it simply limits the amount of air that can enter the carb at any time. So a smaller Venturi restricts the airflow. So with less air, you also need to reduce the amount of fuel to keep the ratio the same. So you need to lean out the engine a bit. Then with a bigger Venturi, more air is entering the engine. So the opposite, you have to richen the engine a bit. And likewise with a small Venturi, because you have less air, that means the engine will have less power. And with a big Venturi, you have more air, so more power. And some drivers, they like to use a smaller Venturi because they think it helps with mileage. And this can be the case. You can have more runtime with a smaller Venturi because remember, you're less air, you have to lean out the engine, you're using less fuel. But what can happen, and you have to be careful of this, is with less power, sometimes you just use more throttle. So if you have a very powerful engine, you might be just barely using the throttle in some sections of the track. But then if you have an engine with less power, you might have to use full throttle more, for example. And so it doesn't always work out the way you think. A smaller Venturi doesn't always have a better runtime. So keep that in mind. Another thing about Venturis to keep in mind is that a smaller Venturi actually makes the engine a bit harder to tune. And if it's really small, it makes it really difficult and inconsistent even. So you can go too small with the Venturi. And the reason is actually pretty simple. I'll try and explain it. So when you adjust the needles on the carburetor, let's say just 1 hour, so a 1/12 of a turn, the amount the fuel flow changes is always the same. So when you have more air, that 1 hour change, it doesn't make as big of a difference to the situation where you have less air. To get the mixture just right with less air, you have to be finer with your adjustment. Maybe if you think about 1 hour as the minute hand, 5 minutes, maybe instead of turning the screws 5 minutes, you have to change to like 2 or 3 minutes to get it right. And to explain easier so everyone understands what's happening, just imagine you're cooking some soup, for example, and you have this small measuring spoon that you use for the salt. And let's say you're just making a small amount of soup and you just need 1 spoon of salt to make it just right. So now, if you add 2, then you just doubled the amount of salt and now it's no good. But then imagine you're making a large amount of soup and you need 20 scoops of this small spoon of salt. So then if you put 21, it's not really going to make a difference. So you see what I mean? The more soup you have, the less precise you have to be with this small spoon of salt. Same goes for the carb. The more air you have, that 1 hour may not be such a big difference. But when you have less air, that 1 hour could be too much. So with less air, a smaller Venturi, the carb is harder to tune because you have to be more precise.
We'll probably sit around and cook some soups and eat bread and desserts and just get all fat and sassy.
Okay, so to conclude, remember when tuning an engine, there's an art to it. There's a formula. Use the formula. Because if you don't, it's just iterations, trial and error, redo it, redo it, redo it. And you need more skill to do that. But if you use this formula, if you check your idle gap, you measure your idle gap, and then tune as explained in this video, skill, it doesn't come into play as much because you're in control. You know what's going on. And there's another good thing about doing it this way. When you know your idle gap, not only do you eliminate the problems with the engine that's running on or the double idle problem, but you also notice if something goes wrong. If there's something mechanically wrong with your engine, like there's an air leak somewhere, maybe your carb boot is torn or a gasket is torn in the manifold or the gasket on the engine. If there's an air leak that has happened, or maybe your front bearing has gone and it's leaking or something, or fuel tank, whatever it may be, hole in the fuel line, something that changes, something that happens, you'll know that it's not you, it's not the tune, because you know where your idle gap is, you know that it's tuned correctly, and that's not going to be a problem. So if your idle gap is too big, if you don't know where that is, you aren't always sure, because maybe when the weather changes or you go to a different track, then because your idle gap is wrong, because it's too big, now you are noticing some problems where at the other track you didn't notice them. So it could just be that your tune is off. But when you know your idle gap, when you know that the carb is tuned correctly, like explained in this video, then when something changes and something is way off, you know it's a mechanical problem and you can find it and fix it. So yeah, I hope you liked this video. And if you did, please like and subscribe. Actually, when we reach 5,000 subscribers, we're gonna have to do something. Lefty, what do you think we should do? When we reach 5,000 subscribers, what do we do?
How about me kicking you in the nuts?
Typical Lefty. Anyway, maybe comment down below. Comment what you think we should do. At 10,000, I already know what I want to do. So hear me out. 10,000 subscribers, I'm going to buy a Kyosho and join the Kyosho Masters. Because Mike Craddock told me I'm allowed to go to the Kyosho Masters in France. So 10,000 subscribers, I'm going to buy a Kyosho, attend the Kyosho Masters in France, and document it on video, of course. So you have that to look forward to. And 5,000, yeah, we have to think of something. And yeah, if you thought this video was helpful, and if you want more videos like this, like I said, comment below with topics, and also maybe consider supporting on Patreon, because that's really how I get all of this stuff done. You know, it's not free, it takes time, equipment, someone has to edit these. So if you want more of these, if you think it's helpful, please consider. Just $1 a month is enough. Get enough people there, boom, we can make even better videos than this one. So I hope you like it, and till next time, I guess.